In 1260, a Mongol emperor did something that wouldn't be attempted again in the West for another 500 years. He declared that paper, just paper, had value, not because it was backed by gold, not because it represented grain or silk, simply because he said so. And if you refused to accept it, death. Within decades, the Mongol Empire was operating the largest unified economy in human history, bigger than Rome at its peak, bigger than any Islamic caliphate, bigger than China under any dynasty. They did this not by conquering more territory, though they did plenty of that, but by inventing a financial system so advanced that modern central banks still use the same blueprint. Here's what makes this disturbing. The Mongols, remembered as brutal nomadic warriors, understood money better than any civilization before them. They created paper currency, enforced it with violence, protected merchants with a network that spanned continents, and extracted wealth at a scale that made them richer than Rome ever was. And when the system collapsed, it collapsed exactly the way fiat currencies always collapse. Through inflation, through loss of trust, and through the realization that paper only has value as long as people believe it does. Welcome to the Financial Detective, where we investigate financial systems like crime scenes, because money, power, and history collide, and someone always profits. This is case file number 3, the Mongol money machine. And by the end of this investigation, you'll understand how nomads became the world's first central bankers, why their paper currency worked for decades before failing catastrophically, and why the Federal Reserve is running the exact same experiment today. The Mongol Empire began with conquest. Genghis Khan united the Mongol tribes in 1206 and launched campaigns that would eventually control territory from Korea to Hungary. The empire was built on violence, speed, and psychological warfare. Cities that resisted were annihilated. Populations were slaughtered. The Mongols terrified the known world. But terror doesn't create wealth, it destroys it. Burned cities don't pay taxes. Dead craftsmen don't produce goods. Devastated farmland doesn't generate revenue. The Mongols faced a fundamental problem. They could conquer territory, but they couldn't extract value from rubble. Early Mongol conquests were profitable through plunder. Gold, silver, slaves, and goods were seized and distributed among the warriors. Plunder is finite. Once you've looted a city, there's nothing left. The Mongols needed a different model. They needed the conquered territories to keep producing, to keep trading wealth that could be taxed. This required a shift from destruction to administration, from looting to governing, and it required something the Mongols didn't have: financial infrastructure. In the 1230s and 1240s, as the Mongol Empire expanded into China, Central Asia, and Persia, they encountered sophisticated economies. These weren't tribal pastoralists. These were merchant civilizations with banking systems, trade networks, and complex taxation. The Mongols could have destroyed these systems. Instead, they learned from them, and then they improved them. This is where the crime scene begins. Because what the Mongols built wasn't just an empire. It was an economic zone, and the currency they created became the world's first large-scale experiment in fiat money, money that existed because the government said it did. Money backed by nothing but authority. Paper money wasn't invented by the Mongols. It was invented in China during the Song dynasty around the 11th century, but the Song used it cautiously in limited regions, backed partially by reserves. The Mongols took this concept and scaled it empire-wide. And they did something the Song never dared. They made paper money the only legal currency. In 1260, Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, issued an imperial decree. All transactions within the empire would be conducted using paper notes called chao. These notes were printed on mulberry bark paper, stamped with official seals, and distributed throughout the realm. Merchants, craftsmen, and peasants were required to accept them at face value. Here's the revolutionary part. The chao wasn't backed by metal reserves. There was no promise of redemption in gold or silver. The currency's value came from 3 sources: imperial decree, legal enforcement, and the threat of violence. If you refused to accept paper money, you could be executed. If you counterfeited it, your family would be killed. The Mongols didn't ask people to trust the currency. They forced them to, and it worked. Why? Because the Mongols controlled both sides of the transaction. They collected taxes in paper money. They paid soldiers in paper money. They required merchants to exchange gold and silver for paper money at government offices. Once you had paper, you needed to spend it because the government would only accept paper. A closed loop. The currency circulated not because people believed in it, but because they had no choice. But the Mongols didn't stop at currency. They built the infrastructure to make trade possible at unprecedented scale. This infrastructure had a name: the Yam system. It was a network of relay stations, roads, and protected routes that stretched across the entire empire. Every 25 to 30 miles, there was a station with fresh horses, food, water, and guards. Merchants could travel from Beijing to Baghdad knowing they wouldn't be robbed, knowing they could resupply, knowing the roads were maintained. This was revolutionary. Before the Mongols, long-distance trade was dangerous, expensive, and slow. Caravans needed armed escorts. Routes were controlled by local warlords who charged tolls. Banditry was constant. The Mongols changed that. They declared merchants under imperial protection. Anyone who attacked a merchant caravan faced execution. Anyone who charged unauthorized tolls faced execution. The Mongols didn't make trade safe out of kindness. They made it safe because trade generated tax revenue, and tax revenue funded the empire. The combination was genius. Paper currency eliminated the need to transport heavy metals. The Yam system made trade fast and safe. Mongol law guaranteed contracts, and the empire's size meant a merchant could cross the known world without changing currency, without renegotiating terms, without dealing with fragmented jurisdictions. The Silk Road, which had existed for centuries, exploded under Mongol rule. Goods flowed from China to Europe faster and in greater quantities than ever before. Spices, silk, porcelain, horses, weapons, ideas, and even diseases moved across continents. The Mongol economy integrated Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe into a single trade network. It was globalization 700 years before the term existed, and at the center of it all was the chow, the paper currency that made it possible. Because trade at this scale required a medium of exchange that was portable, divisible, and standardized. Gold and silver couldn't do it. They were too heavy, too scarce, and too valuable to use for everyday transactions. Paper could, and the Mongols knew it. But here's what most people miss. This wasn't just economic innovation. It was extraction. The Mongols printed money, forced people to use it, and collected taxes in the same money they created. They controlled the supply. They controlled the value, and they controlled the enforcement. It was a closed system designed to funnel wealth upward, to the Khan, to the military, full, to the administration, and for decades it worked flawlessly. First monopoly, the Mongols didn't just issue paper money, they banned alternatives. In 1276, Kublai Khan ordered all gold and silver to be exchanged for paper notes at government offices. Citizens had to surrender their precious metals and receive chow in return. This wasn't voluntary. It was confiscation. This was confiscation. Once the metals were concentrated in state hands, paper became the only option. Second, legal enforcement. Refusing to accept chow was a capital crime. Counterfeiting was punishable by death, often by execution in front of the market where the fake currency was used. The Mongols didn't rely on trust, though rely on trust. They relied on fear, and fear worked. Merchants accepted the currency not because they believed in its value, but because the alternative was execution. Third, tax obligation. The Mongols collected taxes in chow. This created demand. If you owed taxes, you needed paper money. So you had to accept it in transactions. This circularity sustained the currency. The government printed it, spent it into circulation, then collected it back through taxes. Modern economists call this fiat currency. The Mongols just called it policy. Fourth, and this is critical, merchant incentives. While the Mongols forced acceptance of paper money, they simultaneously created the best conditions for trade in world history. The Yam system meant you could move goods safely. Mongol law meant contracts were enforceable. The empire's size meant access to massive markets. Merchants profited enormously, so they tolerated the currency system because everything else worked in their favor. But there was a fifth mechanism, less visible, but just as important. Inflation management, at least initially. The Mongols understood that if you print unlimited money, value collapses. So early Mongol administrations tried to control the money supply. They limited issuance. They burned old, worn-out notes. They maintained a rough balance between currency in circulation and goods available for purchase. This is exactly what modern central banks claim to do. Manage the money supply to prevent inflation. The Mongols were doing it in the 13th century, and for a while it worked. Prices remained relatively stable. Trade flourished. The economy grew, but then the incentives changed. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the Mongol Empire faced military pressure. Wars in Japan failed. Campaigns in Southeast Asia drained resources. Internal succession disputes weakened central authority, and the cost of maintaining the empire kept rising. The solution was obvious. So we'll print more money. The government needed revenue. It couldn't raise taxes fast enough, so it printed and printed and printed and printed. At first, the inflation was gradual. Prices rose slowly. Merchants adjusted. Life continued, but printing accelerated. By the 1350s, the money supply had expanded massively, and prices exploded. What cost 1 chow in 1300 cost 10 chow by 1350, then 50, then 100. People stopped accepting the currency, not because they wanted to refuse, but because it was worthless. You couldn't buy anything with it. The government responded with more violence, more executions, more decrees demanding acceptance. But violence can't create value. It can only enforce rules. And when the rules produce worthless paper, enforcement becomes irrelevant. By the 1360s, the Chaya was dead. The Mongol Yuan dynasty in China collapsed shortly after. The currency experiment, which had worked for over a century, failed exactly the way every fiat currency fails. Through inflation, through loss of confidence, and through the realization that paper only has value if someone restrains the printing press. And nobody restrained it. Act 4. Who profited? The evidence so who actually benefited from the Mongol money machine? The obvious answer is the Khan and the Mongol elite. They controlled the currency, they collected taxes, they confiscated metals, they paid soldiers in depreciated paper while hoarding the real wealth. This was extraction at a massive scale. Wealth flowed from the conquered populations to the ruling class through a mechanism that looked like policy but functioned like theft. But the elite weren't the only winners. Merchants profited enormously, especially those who understood the system. If you were a merchant operating along the Silk Road in the late 1200s, Mongol rule was the best thing that ever happened to you. Trade was safe, routes were protected, legal disputes were resolved quickly, and most importantly, currency was standardized. You didn't need to exchange money at every border. You didn't need to negotiate with local authorities. You operated in a unified economic zone. This created a class of extraordinarily wealthy merchant families, Chinese traders, Persian bankers, Italian merchants like the Polos who traveled to the Mongol court and returned with fortunes. These weren't outsiders exploiting the system. They were collaborators. They profited from Mongol rule and, in return, supported it. But here's the darker side. The Mongols also created a system of tax farming. They auctioned the right to collect taxes to private individuals. You bid for the privilege of collecting taxes from a region, paid the government upfront, then kept whatever you could extract. This incentivized brutal overtaxation. Tax farmers squeezed populations to maximize their returns. The Mongols didn't care. They got paid regardless. This is a recurring pattern in financial history. When extraction is outsourced, cruelty multiplies. The state maintains plausible deniability. The tax farmer takes the blame. And the population suffers. Who didn't profit? The average person, the peasant, the craftsman, the urban worker. They were forced to accept a currency they didn't trust, taxed heavily to fund an empire that didn't serve them, and left vulnerable when inflation destroyed their savings. When the Chow collapsed, the people who had accumulated paper wealth lost everything. The elites, who had converted their wealth into land, gold, and real assets, survived. This is always how fiat currency ends. The people who issue it and the people who understand it profit. Everyone else holds the worthless paper when the music stops. But there's a deeper question. Did the Mongol system make the empire richer than Rome? In absolute terms, yes. The Mongol Empire at its peak controlled more territory, more trade routes, and more economic activity than Rome ever did. Roman wealth was built on tribute, slavery, and conquest. Mongol wealth was built on trade facilitation and monetary control. Rome's economy was regional. The Mongol economy was continental. But Rome lasted centuries. The Mongol unified economy lasted barely 100 years. Why? Oh, because Rome's currency, while debased over time, remained relatively stable for generations. The Mongols printed too much too fast. Rome's institutions outlasted individual emperors. Mongol institutions collapsed when central authority weakened. The comparison reveals something important. Wealth isn't just about scale, it's about sustainability. The Mongols built a larger economy, but they couldn't maintain it. The moment they needed more revenue than trade could generate, they destroyed the currency that made trade possible. Rome faced the same temptation and eventually succumbed, but it took longer. The Mongols speedrun the collapse. Act 5. The system behind the system, the Mongol money system, couldn't exist without a specific kind of power. Centralized, absolute, and willing to use violence to enforce economic policy. This is the foundation of every fiat currency system. Someone must have the authority to declare value. Someone must have the force to compel acceptance. And someone must have the restraint to avoid destroying the system through overissuance. The Mongols had the first two. They lacked the third. But here's what they understood that most people still don't. Money isn't wealth. Money is a claim on wealth. It's a tool for moving value through time and space. And whoever controls the money supply controls the distribution of wealth. The Mongols didn't just tax their empire. They inflated their way to revenue. They printed currency, spent it, and let inflation erode everyone else's holdings. This is taxation without legislation, extraction without announcement. And it's invisible to people who don't understand the mechanism. This same mechanism exists today. It's called monetary policy. Central banks create money. They claim they're managing economic stability. But they're also transferring wealth from savers to debtors, from people holding cash to people holding assets, from the general population to those closest to the money creation process. The Mongols were explicit about it. Modern central banks are more subtle, but the mechanism is identical. Identical. Print money, force acceptance through legal tender laws, collect value through taxes and inflation, repeat. The difference is restraint. Modern central banks claim they've learned from history. They promise to manage the money supply responsibly. They promise to prevent the kind of hyperinflation that destroyed the Chow. And for decades, they've mostly succeeded. But the temptation is always the same. When governments need revenue and taxation is politically difficult, printing money is easy. When wars need funding, printing money is convenient. When crises demand response, printing money is the first tool they reach for. The Mongols gave in to that temptation in the 14th century. Rome gave in gradually over centuries. Weimar Germany gave in after World War I. Zimbabwe gave in the 2000s. Venezuela is giving in right now. Every fiat currency in history has eventually been inflated to worthlessness. Not because the concept is flawed, but because the people controlling it can't resist the temptation to print. The modern investigation just did it faster. Central banks around the world are running the Mongol experiment at scale. The Federal Reserve creates dollars. The European Central Bank creates euros. The Bank of Japan creates yen. All of them backed by nothing but legal enforcement and institutional credibility. And, just like the Mongols, modern central banks enforce acceptance through legal tender laws. Try paying your taxes in gold. Try refusing dollars. Try refusing dollars. You can't. The system requires you to accept the currency. Not because it has intrinsic value, but because the government says so. The parallels are exact. The Mongols printed paper money to fund expansion and wars. Modern governments print money to fund deficits and crises. The Mongols inflated their currency when they needed more revenue. Modern governments call it quantitative easing. The Mongols protected trade routes to generate tax revenue. Modern governments protect payment networks and financial infrastructure for the same reason. Even the collapse mechanism is the same. When a government prints too much, confidence erodes. When confidence erodes, people flee to real assets. And when everyone tries to exit paper wealth simultaneously, the currency dies. We saw this in microcosm in 2020-22. Central banks printed trillions during COVID-19. Inflation spiked. Trust wavered. People bought real estate, stocks, commodities, anything but cash. Central banks raised interest rates to restore confidence. It worked for now. But the underlying dynamic remains. Too much printing, and the system breaks. The only question is timing. The Mongols lasted about a century. The dollar has been a pure fiat currency since 1971, about 53 years. Rome's currency gradually debased over several centuries. Modern central banks have better tools, better data, and better understanding of monetary theory, but they face the same political pressures, the same temptation to print, the same erosion of restraint over time. History doesn't repeat exactly, but the incentive structures remain constant. And the Mongol collapse is a reminder of what happens when currency issuers prioritize short-term needs over long-term stability. Teehee verdict, so what does this mean for you? First, understand that fiat currency isn't modern, it's 800 years old. The Mongols proved it can work, and they proved it can fail. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the sophistication of the people running it. Second, recognize that money is always political. The Mongols used currency as a tool of control. Modern governments do the same. When you hold cash, you hold a government IU. And governments throughout history have been terrible at honoring IU's when honoring them becomes inconvenient. Third, this affects your financial decisions. The Mongol elites who survived converted paper wealth into real assets before the collapse. Land, gold, trade goods. The same logic applies today. Cash loses value over time through inflation. Assets, scarce assets, tend to hold value. That's not investment advice. It's historical pattern recognition. The Mongol money machine made them richer than Rome, for a while. Then it made them a cautionary tale. The system worked until the people running it couldn't resist the temptation to print. And when they printed too much, the entire structure collapsed. Modern central banks are running the same experiment, with better technology, better theory, and centuries of historical data. But the fundamental incentive, the temptation to print more than the economy can absorb, remains unchanged. Now you have the evidence. Now you understand the mechanism. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. If this investigation changed how you see money, subscribe. There are more cases to solve, more systems to expose, more patterns hiding in history. This is the Financial Detective, and the investigation continues.